In 1718, somewhere off the coast of North Carolina, a sailor reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded scrap of paper. His hands were shaking. He already knew what it was before he opened it. A circle of black ink smeared across the center. No words, no explanation, just a dark, ugly stain on a torn piece of parchment. He looked up at the crew standing around him. Nobody said a thing. They didn't have to. That mark meant one thing, and every man on that ship knew exactly what it was. He had just been handed a death sentence. Now imagine a world where your entire fate could be sealed by a piece of paper smaller than your palm. No trial, no judge, no appeal. Just a smudge of tar or ink passed to you by the very men you ate with, slept beside, and fought alongside for months or even years at sea. That was the reality of the black spot, and it was one of the most feared traditions in the Golden Age of Piracy. Picture the Caribbean in the early 1700s. A vast shimmering map of turquoise water stretching from the southern tip of Florida all the way down past Cuba, Hispaniola, Jamaica, and into the chain of smaller islands that curve like a broken spine toward the coast of South America. Nassau in the Bahamas, Port Royal in Jamaica, Tortuga off the northern coast of Haiti. These were the nerve centers of pirate activity. Dozens of harbors, coves, and hidden inlets scattered across thousands of miles of coastline, each one a potential hideout, each one a launching point for raids on merchant vessels heading back to Europe loaded with sugar, rum, tobacco, spices, and gold. Now pull back further, follow the trade routes across the Atlantic. Ships leaving Bristol, London, Lisbon, Seville, loaded with manufactured goods and headed west. Ships returning east, their hulls stuffed with the wealth of the New World. And lurking along those routes, in the narrow channels between islands, in the fog banks off the Carolina coast, in the open waters near the Azores, pirates waited like wolves at a crossroads. This was the geography of piracy. And within this world, among the cutthroats and thieves who crewed these ships, there existed a system, a brutal, surprisingly democratic system. And at the very heart of that system was a tradition so terrifying that even hardened killers feared it more than the gallows. The black spot. But here's the thing, most people get wrong about pirates. We think of them as lawless savages, right? Just a bunch of drunk criminals stabbing each other over treasure. That's the Hollywood version. The truth is far more interesting and far more organized. Pirate ships were, in many ways, the most democratic institutions of their era. While kings ruled Europe by divine right and plantation owners in the Caribbean treated human beings as property, pirate crews were electing their captains by popular vote. They were drafting written constitutions called Articles of Agreement. They were dividing plunder according to predetermined shares. They had disability compensation. If you lost a limb in battle, you received extra payment from the communal treasury. This wasn't chaos. This was organized rebellion. And the black spot was part of that system. It wasn't random violence. It wasn't a superstition. It was a mechanism of accountability handed down from crew to captain when the crew decided their leader had failed them. It was the pirate version of a vote of no confidence, except in this world, losing a vote of no confidence could mean losing your life. To understand why the black spot carried so much weight, you have to understand what life was actually like aboard a pirate vessel. Before we go any further, I need to stop for a second, because what I've been showing you in these videos only scratches the surface. And I realized at some point that the full picture, the actual pirate code, word for word, the real punishment records, the exact treasure division shares, the ports that secretly funded them, it doesn't fit in a video. I put it all into one document, the Black Flag Codex. It's linked below, and the QR code is on your screen. Now, let's keep going. Forget the romanticized nonsense. These ships were floating nightmares. A typical pirate ship in the early 1700s carried anywhere from 75 to 200 men crammed into a wooden vessel roughly 100 feet long. Below deck, the ceiling was so low that most men couldn't stand upright. The air was thick with the stench of unwashed bodies, bilge water, rotting food, and human waste. Rats were everywhere. So were lice, fleas, and cockroaches. Fresh water was rationed and often turned green within weeks. Food was hardtack biscuits riddled with weevils and salted meat so tough it had to be soaked for hours before you could chew it. Disease killed more pirates than combat ever did. Scurvy rotted their gums and loosened their teeth until they fell out. Dysentery turned the lower decks into a horror show. Typhus spread through lice-infested clothing. Malaria and yellow fever swept through crews like wildfire whenever they anchored too close to swampy coastlines. A single outbreak could wipe out half a crew in days. Men who survived disease still faced infected wounds, broken bones set wrong, and dental abscesses that could turn fatal without treatment. The ship's surgeon, if there even was one, worked with rum as anesthetic and a saw as his primary instrument. And on top of all of this, there was the constant threat of violence, not just from enemy ships or Navy patrols, but from each other. Put 150 armed, desperate men on a floating wooden box for months at a time with limited food, limited water, and limited patience, and you get a pressure cooker. Arguments over stolen rations, accusations of cheating at cards, grudges from old slights. Every day was a balancing act between cooperation and murder. This is why the Articles of Agreement existed. They were the glue that held everything together. Before a pirate crew ever set sail, every man signed a document that spelled out the rules. How plunder would be divided, what behaviors were punishable, what the captain's authority actually was. What happened if someone broke the code? And this is the part that matters. In the Royal Navy, a captain's authority was absolute and backed by the full force of the British Empire. Disobey a naval captain and you'd be flogged, keel-hauled, or hanged from the yardarm. But on a pirate ship, the captain served at the pleasure of the crew. He was elected. He could be removed. And the mechanism for removal was the black spot. The process itself was deceptively simple. When enough members of the crew decided the captain had to go, they would take a piece of paper, sometimes a page torn from a Bible, sometimes just a scrap of canvas, and blacken one side with ink, tar, soot, or charcoal. This was then folded and delivered to the captain, often placed in his hand, sometimes slipped under his cabin door, occasionally left on his plate at mealtime. The message was unmistakable. Your time is up. Step down or face the consequences. Now, receiving the black spot didn't automatically mean death. In theory, a captain who received it had the right to address the crew and defend his actions. He could argue his case. He could promise changes. He could try to rally enough supporters to overturn the vote. But in practice, by the time a crew had reached the point of issuing a black spot, the decision was usually already made. The politicking, the whispered conversations, the secret meetings below deck, all of that had already happened. The black spot was the formality at the end of a process, not the beginning, and the consequences of receiving one were severe. At best, the captain was deposed, stripped of his authority, reduced to a common sailor, sometimes marooned on a deserted island with a pistol, a bottle of water, and a day's worth of food. Marooning was considered almost worse than death. You were left on a sandbar or a tiny island, sometimes no more than a strip of sand with a single palm tree, and expected to either find rescue or end your own life with the single shot you'd been given. The pistol wasn't a weapon, it was a mercy. Most marooned men never saw another human face again. At worst, he was killed on the spot, thrown overboard in open water miles from shore, shot through the back of the head, stabbed on the quarterdeck in front of the entire crew. There are accounts of deposed pirate captains being tied to the mast and left to die of exposure, baking under the Caribbean sun for days, while their former crew sailed the ship around them as if nothing had changed. The brutality of this system makes more sense when you consider what kind of failures would trigger a black spot in the first place. This wasn't about personality conflicts. This was about survival. A captain might receive the black spot for leading the crew into a failed attack that cost lives, for hoarding plunder instead of dividing it fairly, for showing cowardice in battle, for making navigational decisions that left the ship becalmed in open water with dwindling supplies, for cruelty that crossed even pirate standards of acceptable violence. One of the most famous cases involved Edward Teach, better known as Blackbeard. Now, Blackbeard is one of those figures who has been so thoroughly mythologized that separating fact from fiction is nearly impossible. But what we do know is this. By 1718, Blackbeard commanded a small fleet operating out of the Outer Banks of North Carolina. He had cultivated a terrifying reputation, braiding slow-burning fuses into his beard so that his face was wreathed in smoke during battle. He was, by all accounts, genuinely frightening. But Blackbeard also understood something crucial about pirate leadership. Fear alone wasn't enough. You had to deliver results. You had to keep the crew fed, paid, and confident that following you was better than the alternatives. And by the summer of 1718, Blackbeard's crew was getting restless. There are historical accounts suggesting that Blackbeard's crew considered issuing him the Black Spot after he deliberately ran his flagship, the Queen Anne's Revenge, aground near Beaufort Inlet, North Carolina. The suspicion was that Blackbeard had done this intentionally to reduce the number of crew members he had to share plunder with. By losing the ship, he could claim the treasure was lost, then split a hidden portion among a smaller group of loyalists. The grounding of the Queen Anne's Revenge is one of the great mysteries of pirate history. The ship was a former French slave vessel that Blackbeard had captured and converted into his flagship, mounting 40 guns on her decks and turning her into one of the most feared vessels in the Atlantic. Losing her wasn't an accident of bad seamanship. The channel near Beaufort was well known, and Blackbeard had sailed it before. The crew's suspicion that their captain had sabotaged his own flagship to cheat them out of their share was, by pirate standards, an unforgivable betrayal. Whether that specific story is true or not, it illustrates the fundamental tension at the heart of pirate governance. The captain needed the crew needed the captain, but neither side fully trusted the other. And the Black Spot was the crew's ultimate insurance policy against betrayal. Another well-documented case involves Charles Vane, one of the most aggressive pirates of the Golden Age. Vane operated primarily in the Caribbean and was known for his ruthlessness and his refusal to accept the king's pardon, a blanket amnesty offered by the British Crown in 1718 to any pirate who agreed to give up the life. Vane's downfall came not from the law, but from his own crew. In November 1718, Vane's ship encountered a French man-of-war, a heavily armed naval vessel that outgunned them significantly. Vane, recognizing the odds, ordered a retreat. His crew was furious. They had expected a fight, and in their eyes, Vane had shown cowardice. The very next day, the crew held a vote. Vane was deposed as captain and replaced by his quartermaster, a man named Calico Jack Rackham. Vane was given a small sloop and a handful of loyal followers and sent on his way. The Black Spot in all but name. A captain judged, found wanting, and stripped of everything. Vane's story didn't end well. He continued pirating with his diminished crew, was eventually shipwrecked, captured by the British, and hanged in Port Royal, Jamaica in 1721. His body was left hanging in a gibbet as a warning to others. But Vane's deposition reveals something important about the Black Spot tradition. It wasn't about personal loyalty or affection, it was about competence. The crew's survival depended on the captain's ability to make good decisions under pressure. A captain who couldn't identify a winnable fight from a suicidal one was a liability. A captain who couldn't navigate was a death sentence for everyone on board. A captain who stole from his own crew was worse than the enemy. The democratic nature of pirate governance is one of the most fascinating aspects of this entire era, and the Black Spot sits right at the center of it. Consider the contrast with legitimate society at the time. In the early 1700s, England was ruled by a monarchy. The House of Commons existed, but voting rights were limited to male property owners, which excluded the vast majority of the population. Women had no political rights whatsoever. The poor had no voice. Servants and laborers were essentially at the mercy of their employers. And yet, on pirate ships, every man had an equal vote. Every man, regardless of background, nationality, or social class. Former slaves sailed alongside former naval officers. Escaped indentured servants voted alongside skilled navigators. The captain answered to the crew, not the other way around. It was, in a very real sense, one of the purest forms of democracy operating anywhere in the Western world at that time. The Black Spot was the enforcement mechanism of that democracy. It was the tool that ensured power didn't calcify, that no captain could become a tyrant, that the collective will of the crew remained supreme. In modern terms, it was impeachment, recall election, and potential execution all rolled into one small piece of stained paper. Now it's worth addressing the elephant in the room. How much of what we think we know about the black spot actually comes from history, and how much comes from fiction? The honest answer is complicated. The term black spot itself was popularized and possibly invented by Robert Louis Stevenson in his 1883 novel Treasure Island. In the book, the character Billy Bones receives a black spot, a piece of paper with a black circle on one side and a written message on the other. It terrifies him so completely that he dies of a stroke on the spot. Later in the novel, Long John Silver also receives one, cut from a page of the Bible. Stevenson's depiction became so iconic that it essentially defined the concept for popular culture. Every pirate movie, book, and television show that features the black spot is to some degree referencing Treasure Island. But here's what's important. Stevenson didn't invent the concept from nothing. He was drawing on real pirate traditions of crew-initiated removal of captains, which are well documented in historical records. The specific ritual of using a blackened piece of paper may or may not have been a widespread practice, but the underlying system, the crew's right to depose a captain through collective action, is absolutely verified by historical evidence. Stop for a second. What you just heard about the Pirate Code is the part that rewrites everything you thought you knew. But it only lands when you see the actual shares, the exact fractions written into the Articles of Agreement, the punishments, the port records, the names of the men who funded them from government offices. It's all in the Black Flag Codex, linked in the description. 5 seconds, grab it now, because what comes next builds directly on it. Link is below. QR code is on your screen. Captain Charles Johnson's book, A General History of the Pirates, published in 1724, describes multiple instances of crews voting to remove their captains. The specifics vary. Sometimes a formal vote was held, sometimes a mutiny simply erupted, sometimes the deposition was peaceful, sometimes it was violent. But the principle was consistent. Pirate captains held their position by consent, and that consent could be withdrawn. Whether a literal blackened piece of paper was the delivery mechanism is, in some ways, beside the point. The black spot represents something real, a system of accountability that operated in one of the most lawless environments in human history. And that system worked, for a time, remarkably well. Let's talk about the quartermaster, because you can't understand the black spot without understanding this role. On a pirate ship, the quartermaster was arguably more powerful than the captain. The captain had supreme authority during battle, making tactical decisions, directing the crew, and leading boarding actions. But during peacetime, which was most of the time, the quartermaster ran the ship. The quartermaster distributed food and water. The quartermaster settled disputes between crew members. The quartermaster oversaw the division of plunder. The quartermaster enforced the Articles of Agreement, and critically, the quartermaster was usually the one who delivered the black spot to the captain when the crew had voted for his removal. This separation of powers is remarkable when you think about it. The pirates had essentially created a system of checks and balances centuries before political philosophers would formalize the concept. The captain was the executive, the quartermaster was the legislature, the crew was the electorate, and the black spot was the mechanism by which the electorate could recall the executive. There's one more dimension to this that doesn't get discussed enough: the psychological dimension. Imagine you're a pirate captain. You have authority over 150 armed, violent, desperate men. You know that any one of them could slip a piece of blackened paper into your pocket while you sleep. You know that your continued leadership depends entirely on your ability to keep the majority satisfied. You know that the moment you lose their confidence, you could be dead before sunrise. That constant awareness shaped behavior. It made pirate captains more responsive to their crew's needs than almost any other authority figure of the era. A captain who wanted to stay alive listened to complaints, addressed grievances, made sure plunder was divided fairly, made sure food and water were distributed equitably, because the alternative wasn't losing an election. The alternative was a knife in the dark. This psychological pressure created a perverse kind of good governance. Pirate captains who lasted, men like Bartholomew Roberts, Samuel Bellamy, and Henry Every, were not just skilled sailors and fighters. They were skilled politicians. They knew how to read a room, or in this case, read a deck. They knew when to be generous and when to be firm. They understood that their authority was borrowed, not owned. Bartholomew Roberts is a particularly interesting case. Known as Blackbeard, Roberts captured over 400 ships during his career, more than any other pirate in history. He was also known for his strict personal code. He didn't drink alcohol. He dressed immaculately. He held regular crew meetings where grievances could be aired openly. And his articles of agreement were among the most detailed and progressive of any pirate crew. Roberts understood that the black spot was always a possibility. So he governed in a way that made it unlikely. He kept his crew well-fed, well-paid, and well-informed. He shared intelligence about potential targets. He explained his navigational decisions. He was, in the most unlikely of settings, a genuinely effective leader. When Roberts was finally killed in battle off the coast of West Africa in 1722, his crew didn't celebrate. They mourned. Several threw his body overboard in full ceremonial dress to prevent the British from displaying it as a trophy. That kind of loyalty doesn't come from fear. It comes from respect. And respect in the pirate world was the only currency that could keep the black spot at bay. Compare that to someone like Edward Lowe, one of the most sadistic pirates in recorded history. Lowe was known for torturing prisoners, mutilating captured sailors, and inflicting punishment on his own crew for minor infractions. His leadership style was pure terror, and it worked for a while. But eventually, his crew had enough. The accounts of Lowe's final days are murky, but the most credible versions suggest that his own crew mutinied against him sometime around 1724. Some accounts say he was set adrift. Others say he was handed to the French authorities, who hanged him in Martinique. Either way, his reign of terror ended the way such reigns always end. The people he brutalized turned on him. Lowe never received a formal black spot as far as we know, but the principle was the same. When a captain's behavior became intolerable, the crew acted. The specific ritual mattered less than the underlying reality. The crew held the ultimate power. Always. This brings us to perhaps the most important question about the black spot. Why did it work? Why did this system of accountability function in an environment where there was no police force, no court system, no external authority to enforce the rules? The answer lies in something economists call reputation effects. In the pirate world, your reputation was everything. A captain known for being fair attracted better crew members, which meant better fighters, better sailors, and more successful raids. A captain known for being treacherous or incompetent struggled to recruit. And in a world where your survival depended on having a full, capable crew, reputation was literally a matter of life and death. Consider how recruitment actually worked. When a pirate ship docked at a port like Nassau or Tortuga, the captain needed to replace crew members lost to battle, disease, or desertion. Sailors looking for a berth would ask around. Who's fair with the shares? Who keeps his crew fed? Who picks fights they can win? A captain with a reputation for greed or incompetence found himself standing on the dock watching experienced sailors walk past him to sign on with someone else. And an undermanned pirate ship was a dead pirate ship. You needed bodies to man the cannons, to board enemy vessels, to work the rigging during storms. Without a full crew, you were just a target floating in open water. The black spot amplified this effect. Word traveled fast along the pirate routes. If a captain received the black spot and was deposed, every pirate in the Caribbean knew about it within weeks. That captain's ability to ever lead again was effectively destroyed. The black spot wasn't just a removal from power, it was a permanent mark on a man's reputation, a black mark. And in a community built on trust between thieves, trust was the scarcest and most valuable commodity of all. There's a dark irony in all of this. The Golden Age of Piracy, roughly 1650 to 1730, ended not because the pirates lost their ability to govern themselves, but because the legitimate governments of Europe finally committed enough resources to stamping them out. The Royal Navy deployed squadrons specifically tasked with hunting pirates. Colonial governors who had previously tolerated or even cooperated with pirates were ordered to enforce the law. The noose tightened, and as the external pressure increased, the internal systems began to fail. Crews grew more desperate. Captains became more reckless. The careful balance between authority and accountability that the black spot represented started to break down. More mutinies, more violence, more paranoia. The system that had kept pirate ships functioning as effective fighting units couldn't survive the slow strangulation of a world that had decided pirates had to go. By 1730, the Golden Age was effectively over. The great pirate captains were dead or captured. The harbors that had sheltered them were under firm government control. The trade routes were patrolled by warships that outgunned anything a pirate could float. Nassau, which had once been the unofficial capital of the Pirate Republic, was now governed by Woodes Rogers, a former privateer turned pirate hunter who had hanged 8 pirates on his first day in office. Port Royal had been rebuilt as a Royal Navy base. Tortuga was under French military control. One by one, the sanctuaries vanished, and with them, the world that had made the black spot possible. But the black spot endured, at least as an idea. It survived in stories passed from sailor to sailor, in tavern tales told along the waterfronts of London and Bristol. It survived in ballads and penny dreadfuls. And then, in 1883, Robert Louis Stevenson gave it its most famous incarnation, and it became immortal. Treasure Island turned the black spot from a piece of pirate history into a piece of world mythology. The scene where Billy Bones receives his mark has been adapted, referenced, and reimagined hundreds of times. It appears in Pirates of the Caribbean, in video games, in television shows, in comic books. The image of a blackened circle on a torn piece of paper has become one of the most recognizable symbols in all of fiction. But underneath the fiction, the real story is more compelling. A group of outcasts, criminals, and fugitives operating outside the boundaries of civilization created a governance system that was in some ways more fair, more responsive, and more accountable than anything the so-called civilized world was offering at the time. They gave every man a voice. They held their leaders to account. And when those leaders failed, they had a mechanism to remove them. The black spot was that mechanism. Simple, brutal, effective. Was it perfect? Obviously not. The same system that enabled accountability also enabled mob rule. Capable captains were sometimes deposed by cowardly crews who didn't want to fight. Good leaders were occasionally removed because of personal vendettas rather than genuine failures. The line between justice and mutiny was often impossible to distinguish. But the fact that it existed at all, in that time, in that place, among those people, tells us something important about human nature. Even in the most extreme circumstances, even among people society had completely written off, there was a drive toward fairness, toward collective governance, toward the idea that power should answer to the people it serves. The black spot wasn't just a pirate tradition, it was a statement, a declaration that no one, no matter how powerful, how feared, or how ruthless, is above the judgment of those they lead. 300 years later, that idea is still terrifying. And it should be, because the best leaders in any era are the ones who govern as if a black spot might be waiting in their pocket tomorrow morning. That's the real legacy of the black spot, not the ink-stained paper, not the fictional scenes in novels and movies. The principle, the idea that authority is earned, maintained through competence and fairness, and can be revoked by the people who granted it. Pirates understood this better than most kings ever did. And that might be the most surprising thing about the Golden Age of Piracy. Not the treasure, not the battles, not the skull and crossbones flying over the Caribbean. The most surprising thing is that a bunch of thieves, murderers, and outcasts figured out something about governance that the rest of the world is still struggling with today.